Hi, this is Muho. Today I want to upload the second part of my teacher's house, which will become a short series. And it is based on Edward's winter report from this year. The report is about Antaiji during the time when my teacher, Miyaola Roshi, was the abbot. And the other day I uploaded the introduction. Today will be the first part of the first chapter of that winter report. It's entitled A Delicate Flower in the Trump of Zen. I divided that chapter into four parts. Today will be about the first part. And in the beginning, Edward writes some introductory sentences, and then the whole rest of the chapter, as all of the other chapters will follow, consists of an interview where Edward asks questions and I will answer those questions. And first, I want to give you some context for that interview. The main topic is Antaiji at the time of my teacher, Miyaola Roshi, but I will also be talking about my teacher's teacher, Watanabe Roshi. When I first came to Antaiji, Watanabe Roshi had already retired and was living in Italy. But I visited him once in Italy, and then later, after Watanabe Roshi returned to Japan, I visited him quite often, and I had a quite close relationship with Watanabe Roshi, although it was never a teacher-student relationship in the narrow sense, I would say. When I became a homeless in Osaka Castle Park, Watanabe Roshi visited me several times, and was basically Watanabe Roshi who's responsible for the fact that I became the abbot of Antaiji later. Then also the teacher of my teacher's teacher, which would be Uchiyama Roshi, Watanabe Roshi's teacher, is mentioned in the interview. He had retired long before I came to Antaiji, but he was still alive at the time, and we would visit him usually in the winter when the monks go baking in the Kyoto-Osaka region. We would visit Uchiyama Roshi once a year, and there was the possibility to ask him questions. There were also some of us who sent him letters, and he would respond in a very nice, friendly way. Also, Uchiyama Roshi's book were usually the first books that people would be given to read when they came to Antaiji, or I was introduced to Uchiyama Roshi's books when I came to Japan in 1990. To Kyoto, and at the time I couldn't find a place in Kyoto where you could sit daily or where you could participate in a real session. There were zazenka in Kyoto where you could sit with usually elderly Japanese people once a month or so. But although there's lots of rinzai temples in Kyoto, most of those places kept their doors shut for regular lay people like myself, especially if they were foreigners. But then fortunately I heard of Okumura Shohaku Roshi, Shohaku Okumura, who now lives in Indiana, but he lived in a place called Shorinji, which was just outside of Kyoto at the time, and he would come to Kyoto once a month to give Dharma talks. And I attended one of those Dharma talks and heard that he would do session later during the month in his place in Shorinji. So I went to these 5-day sessions every month. And it was through Shohaku Okumura Roshi's introduction that later that year I would first visit Antaiji and spend half a year at that time in Antaiji. But that was when I knew I had found my place. And Okumura Roshi is the person who translated a lot of stuff by Uchiyama Roshi and also by Dogen Zenji. And now I think in America he's quite famous, but at the time nobody knew him. But fortunately, I had the fortune to meet him, and he first gave me stuff to read, like Uchiyama Roshi's Opening the Hand of Thought. And he was in the process of translating and editing the first version of the Dharma of Homeless Kodo, sayings by Sawaki Roshi with commentary by Uchiyama Roshi. So that's how I first got to read Uchiyama Roshi, at first in the English language, but then when I went to Antaiji, I found all these other books in the library. Was also very much fascinated by the Sawaki Roshi quotes that Uchiyama Roshi had written down first for himself, but then later came out in book form. And you can find part of that stuff on our homepage. I will put a link below. There's quite some good texts on our homepage as well. Of course, you can find not so much by Sawaki Roshi in English in print, I think, but Uchiyama Roshi, there's some important books by him. And during that year, 1990, in the winter, was the first time when I met with Uchiyama Roshi. It was usually over tea. Once also there was some drinking involved, where me and a couple of university professors from Kyoto, we went together to visit Uchiyama Roshi with some bottles of whiskey. But usually it was over tea, and it usually was in the afternoon, so I was never in that close relationship as with Watanabe Roshi, and of course it was not a teacher-student relationship in that sense. But I had some talks with Uchiyama Roshi, but of course never with Sawaki Roshi. All I know and all I heard about Sawaki Roshi, I know either from the books or from people who told me these anecdotes. Often it was Watanabe Roshi, who still knew Sawaki Roshi when he was alive. My teacher also never met with Sawaki Roshi. The text today, I mean, you can read the text for yourself. I'm not going to read the text. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will put a link below that will lead you to the Antaiji website, and there you find Edward's text and the interview. Again, as another small piece of context, I've written about this in the Adult Practice series almost 15 years ago, I guess. The first thing I heard from my teacher when I was still a university student, and I visited from Kyoto, and I came for half a year. I had this first interview with him where he asked me, well, what have you came for? And I said, I want to learn about Buddhism. And he said, you fool, Antaiji is not a school. You create Antaiji. This saying, you create Antaiji, impressed me a lot and became a lifelong teaching. You need to create this place, even if it's only 6 months. What you can learn here and what you will not learn here depends on you. It depends on your attitude, it depends on what you do with your eyes and ears and with your body. I think that's what he meant when he said you create antaiji. And then there was another thing that I heard him say, both to others and myself, after a couple of years after I became ordained, which was you don't count at all. Antaiji is not about you, which seemed to be a complete contradiction. First you say you create antaiji, then he says it's not about you. You don't count. And I had to learn that these two things belong together. You need to forget yourself to be able to create the place. Creating antaiji doesn't mean that you make antaiji all about yourself. If you try to do this, there will be constant conflict with the other people that are in antaiji who are also creating antaiji, just as you are. The only way to create one antaiji is that each of the people at antaiji completely forgets themselves. So these are the most important two things that I think I learned from my teacher. And after I became the abbot, almost 18 years from now, I have ordained, I think, more than 20 people, most of whom have left antaiji long ago. With some I'm still in contact, with others I have no idea where they are, what they're doing. More than half of them are Westerners, and the rest is Japanese. And I try to teach them all the same, which is basically what I learned from my teacher, which is you need to create antaiji. If you don't do it, nobody's going to do it for you. But it's not about you. You don't count at all. These two things need to get together. And another thing that I sometimes tell my students is you need to grow like a cucumber. That's also something that I wrote in one of the adult practice articles. What does it mean to grow like a cucumber? At antaiji, we use only a piece of thin thread, one thread or line, a thin rope that we hang from a piece of bamboo, or we can also grow the cucumbers in the vinyl house, and it would be hanging from the roof of the vinyl house. And just around this season, at the end of April, the beginning of May, the cucumbers have grown to, I don't know, about this size also. And you plant them in their spots. Before that, they will grow in the pots, and then they go out into the vegetable field, or you plant them in the vinyl house, and this rope is hanging from above. And what is happening next is, when they continue to grow, they grip that rope and grow straight upwards, and then in the summer, in July, August, will have lots of delicious cucumbers. And all they need until then is lots of water and maybe some fertilization, and that's it. And well, in that metaphor, the cucumber stands for the novice monk or the Buddhist practitioner. And this thin rope stands for the Buddha's teaching. So you have to get a grip on that teaching by yourself and make sure that you grow using that rope as your guidance. And From my experience, such students are not easy to find. Often, especially with my Japanese students, I have the feeling that they are more like tomatoes rather than cucumbers. Tomatoes you plant at the same time during the year, and you can harvest them also almost around the same time of the year in summer. Tomatoes might sometimes even be more delicious than the cucumbers. One big difference is that to grow tomatoes, a thin rope alone is not enough. They need more stability. They need a construction that in Antaiji we usually build out of bamboo. They need a firm construction of bamboo, and just having the construction alone also is not enough because they don't grip on it like cucumbers. So they need to be tied to that construction every couple of days. Especially when the rainy season starts and they grow faster, every couple of days you need to tie them to the construction. Otherwise, when the wind blows, they will fall all over. If the construction in itself collapses, all of the tomatoes will fall. So it needs to be a stable construction. They also need water, but if they're hit by the rain, they start to rot easily. So usually for the tomatoes you also build a roof to protect them. You have to remove the extra shoots, so they grow straight up, but then there's extra shoots left and right. If you don't remove those extra shoots, you will have lots of green leaves and branches in the summer, but only very few fruits. So you have to take off these extra shoots, which also is a lot of work. So either way, tomatoes are just as delicious, maybe even more delicious as the cucumbers in summer, but it takes a lot of work to grow them. The reason why many Japanese tend to grow like tomatoes might be that, well, first of all, when they're still young, they're, well, you could also almost say from a Western perspective, they're almost spoiled by their mothers. They are cared for by their mothers in a very loving way. And in kindergarten and in school, then they're tied in a very soft way to an almost invisible construction that gives them stability. In middle school, this construction becomes more visible and they're tied very firmly and the extra shoots are removed. In Germany we don't have that kind of middle school. I doubt that it exists in America, but it's we had probably that kind of education in Germany about 100 years ago, but it still exists in Japan, that then they have to learn to develop discipline and let go of their craving for individuality. And then little Japanese society as a whole, if you're not able to live like a tomato to a certain degree, you will have difficulties to conform to Japanese society. So Japanese society favors tomatoes, which is a reason why many Japanese, when they become monks also, they're good at listening to their teachers. They don't talk back to their superiors, the so-called senpai. But there's not much of, how do you say, individual initiative. So like when you tell a Japanese novice, you create antaiji, often they don't even know what you're talking about. What do you mean? I'm just a novice. You tell me how to create antaiji and I'll do it the way you tell me. So that's one type of student, the tomato student. How about my Western students? Are they all like cucumbers? No. The typical Western student is more like a pumpkin. first, when the first two small leaves appear, they look almost like cucumbers. Basically, it's the same family. Cucumbers and pumpkins, they come from the same family. They look almost the same when they're a week or 2 weeks old. And that's why it sometimes happens in Antalya that people mistakenly plant a pumpkin among the cucumbers. But what happens in summer is there's chaos in the cucumber area, because that one pumpkin will completely ignore this rope and will grow all over the place. And with his, how do you call these, well, the branches and leaves and whatever, what he grows there will cover the other vegetables and might even destroy the cucumbers growing around him. So that's the kind of typical Western student that's always like, me, I want to do it like this way. I know best what I want to do. I know about practice, and I know my Dogen Zenji best. I know my Shobogen, so I know what the Zen is all about, and don't tell me anything. The typical Western student who's gonna question society, and is gonna question his family values, and gonna question authority, gonna question even his teacher, but who's unable to question the one thing that's most important to question, basically himself. Pumpkins are unable to forget themselves, let go of themselves and their ideas. So the tomato type of student would be a student that's maybe able to forget himself, but who's unable to create anti-idea. The pumpkin student is somebody who tries his best to create anti-idea, but it's a kind of anti-idea that's all about him. The pumpkin student tries to take initiative, but it produces no real fruits because he's unable to forget himself. And I try to remind my students that it's not about tomatoes, and it's not about growing pumpkins in Antalya, although we grow all of these vegetables in the field, and they're all important to have. Tomatoes take a little bit more care. Pumpkins, they need more space outside. They need a meter or more in between themselves. But when it comes to growing as Buddhist practitioners, we should aim at the cucumbers. But from my experience, the cucumbers are difficult to find. And it happens that sometimes I sigh, and at the end of the day I'm like this, and how come that there's no cucumbers here at Antalya? I got lots of tomatoes here, I got lots of pumpkins. Where are the cucumbers? How many more years will I have to wait until finally a cucumber arrives? And if Dogen Zenji would still be alive and visit me at Antalya, he would probably say, well, there's only one person who's responsible for that, and that's you. In the Gakudo Yoshinshu, I think it was the 5th chapter, which is about finding a true teacher. Gakudo Yoshinshu, for those of you who don't know the text, essential text, there's probably a number of translations in English out there on the internet. There's one published by Soto Shu as The Heart of Zen. That's a translation by Okumura Shohaku Roshi, which I can recommend. Anyway, lots of very good practical advice by Dogen Zenji about what it takes to practice. The first thing he says, you need to have Bodhi mind. another thing is you have to start with practice, and you have to start right now. And for that you need a teacher. If you don't have a teacher, it's better not to practice at all, he says. And in that chapter on finding the right teacher, he says a teacher is like a carpenter, and the student is like a piece of wood. If you have a perfect piece of wood, but a miserable carpenter, then he will screw that piece of wood up. On the other hand, if you have a great carpenter, although the wood might not be the best quality, a good carpenter can work with that piece of wood and can make the best out of it. So if you have a teacher and a number of students, but none of them seem to actually develop into anything, it cannot be that it's the fault of the students. And if the teacher says, well, if I just had other students, if I had just one competent student, would be like a carpenter who builds one house after the other and they all collapse, and the carpenter says, well, if I only had the right wood, I would finally build the perfect house. It's just, unfortunately, nobody gives me the right wood. So much of what Dogen Zenji has to say about teachers who complain about their students. The student for the teacher is like a mirror. Now that's something that I do not tell my students too often. I mean, I say it now here on YouTube, and I've written this in books as well, but I don't emphasize this point too often, and the reason for this is that if you listen to this kind of talk, or if you read this part of the Gakudo Yujinchu in the position of the student, there's the temptation to say, well, the responsibility of my practice lies with the teacher. If I get enlightened or not depends on if I find the right teacher or not. So I've been practicing with this teacher now for a couple of years. I'm still not enlightened. What's wrong? Well, it must be the wrong teacher, according to Dogen. And I remember having these kinds of doubts myself more than 20 years ago. I'd been ordained in Antaiji in 1993, I think, when I was 25 years old. And after a couple of years, after 2 or 3 years, I started to have doubts. Maybe some of you who watch this have had the same kind of doubts, or maybe even those who have never been in a teacher-student relationship in Zen have experienced similar things in relationships. For example, when you're married. In the West, you're not forced into a marriage. You choose whom you want to marry, and you marry him or her because you love him or her. And probably a lot of people feel that, well, that one person is the only one. Almost like in this Kiss song, I was made for loving you, you were made for loving me. But then, after 2 or 3 years, surprise, surprise, you're not so sure anymore. There are other guys out there, there's other girls out there, and out of a sudden that special one is not so special anymore, and on a scale from 0 to 100, when he or she were 100 in the beginning, now they're somewhere between 30 and 40 maybe. Whatever. The same can happen in a teacher-student relationship. Actually, lots or most of the Soto novice monks today in Japan ordain only for the reason that they were born in a Buddhist temple. So their father is a Buddhist priest, and often as high school students, sometimes as college students, they become the disciples of their father, their biological father. They can't choose their teacher. Well, in theory they can, but in practice they become the students of their fathers. And that's the way everybody expects that. Their father expects that. The parish that supports the temple expects that. That's basically the thing to do. So they don't have very high expectancies from their teacher. Well, they don't look at their father as their Buddhist teacher in the first place. They just take the job from him, and they learn the minimum of what it takes to do a Buddhist funeral. And then there's a minority of people who actually ordain because they want to practice Buddhism. They want to practice Zen. That's probably true for all of the foreigners who come to Japan to do that, and probably the same for all of the foreigners who practice Zen in the West right now. They do it because that's what they want to do. It's also true for a small amount of Japanese people in Japan today. And the advantage you have as such a person is you can choose your own teacher. If you're born in a temple, you have no choice. You have to ordain with your father. You can look around and choose the one teacher who you think is a true teacher. And that's what I did. And when I found my teacher in Antaji, I thought I had found that one teacher, or at least a teacher that's a really genuine teacher who practices what he preaches, who concentrates all his efforts on the Dharma. But then after 2 or 3 years, just like it can happen in a romantic relationship, I started to have my doubts. I knew from the start that my teacher was also open to sharing a glass of sake or beer at times. But then at one point I thought, well, maybe he's drinking a little too much. And, well, smoking, it's not that it bothered me, but then drinking, smoking, partying almost daily at night after the Zen, all the parties going on. And yeah, you could get angry as well, and at first you try to rationalize that, oh, he's trying to help me, he's trying to give me an impulse there with his outburst of anger, but then after a while you think, oh, maybe he has just some anger issues there, who knows. So anyway, to cut the long story short, and it's not short anymore, it's already quite long, but either way, the point I'm trying to make is, like so many other students, at one point of my practice I had really serious doubts about my teacher and if I found the right teacher, and if maybe the reason why my practice wouldn't go ahead, that I wouldn't come ahead with my practice, maybe was the fact that I hadn't found the right teacher. Maybe I should change the teacher. There's other teachers around there. It's not that they're lots, but still, I mean, if you look, if I looked for another teacher, I might find one. And at that time, it didn't feel like a thing that I could do, that I would just go to Miyaura Roshi and tell him, sorry, but I think that maybe you're not the right teacher for me. I didn't have the balls to do that. But I already knew Watanabe Roshi quite well at the time. He was the teacher of my teacher. I visited him at one point in the winter. And although Watanabe Roshi was also a very strict and tough guy, to me, as he was my teacher's teacher, he was just like this grandfatherly figure for him. I was like a grandchild in the Dharma. So I could discuss with him things that I wouldn't have felt comfortable to discuss with my direct teacher, although in the Dharma lineage he was even one position higher up. So one winter I went to visit him in his temple in Wakayama Prefecture at the time, and we went to the hot springs and we shared a bottle of sake after that, and I would tell him all these doubts I had about practice at Antaishin, about my teacher and everything else. And he would say, if the student is a fool, he will find only a teacher who's also a fool. A foolish student will get a foolish teacher. And well, the foolish teacher he was talking about was Miyaura Roshi, was his student. From the position of Dogen Zenji, he should have said, well, if your teacher is a fool, must mean that your teacher's teacher, myself, has the responsibility. But he said basically the opposite. If the teacher's a fool, that's because the student is a fool. If the student is a fool, any teacher that he looks at will look like a fool. I think there's also this saying that a donkey who looks at the world will see the world of a donkey. A monkey, or the same for a monkey, for anything. So you can introduce a foolish student to any teacher, and might be the best teacher around there. If you introduce a foolish student to even the best teacher, he will only see the fool. He will only see a fool there. So that's one great teaching that Watanabe Roshi gave me, and that's in the interview that I will link to today. I'm also referring to some of the stuff that Watanabe also said during that meeting at the time. Basically, like, look at Uchiyama Roshi. If I had to give him a score on a scale from 0 to 100, I would give him -50. It's one of the things he said. He would sleep until 10 o'clock in the mornings and then complain about his headache and ask me about the newspaper and read the newspaper even through lunch. So he was really nothing in comparison to Sawaki Roshi. But today, you and a lot of other Westerners know Uchiyama Roshi. He's famous. Why? Because I created Uchiyama Roshi. The student has to create the teacher. But how do you do that? That's a real koan. If you're in a real teacher-student relationship, you know, that's not so easy to do. It's easy to talk about, maybe. Sounds nice in theory. How do you create the teacher as a student? And again, just as in the case of Antaiji, to do that, you have to completely forget yourself. You cannot make the teacher all about yourself. Okay, so much from my side. Please have fun with the first part of the Delicate Flower and the Trump of Zen chapter of Edward Moore's Winter Report. And hopefully I don't forget to put also the links below that will take you to texts by Uchiyama Roshi and Sawaki Roshi and Adult Practice. I probably will also put up a link to the tomato and cucumbers article that I wrote long ago. But it's basically all in what I already said today. Okay, I'm not quite sure when I will come back to you. In a few days I will be back in Antaiji. We will have our retreat then until the 6th of May, and probably only after that I will come back to this My Teacher's House series. Until then, enjoy.